It is October, which means it's time for Halloween soon-ish. And this month, we're going to be looking at all of the spooky things. And even though I don't think as a white person I'm allowed to say spook anymore because it has some past racial undertones and, you just can't say anything anymore. But that's not what this podcast is about, so I'm just not even going to bother pulling my soapbox out. It's time for Our Weird World.
Our Weird World.
Welcome to Our Weird World. I am your host, John Henson. And like I said, all this month we're looking at Halloween-themed stories. And I am actually saving one of the scariest, most horrifying stories I have ever come across for the end of the month. If you thought like Albert Fish or Andre Chikatilo were bad, you are not even remotely prepared for how terrifying this story is. But that's later. That's Halloween week. Next 3 weeks, we're going to have a little bit more fun with just some more traditional Halloween characters, including this week where we're looking at some stories about witches. We've got quite a few here. We're going over Malleus Maleficarum today, which I'll explain what that is here in a bit. We're also looking at the stories of Margaret Matson, George Burroughs, Giles Corey, Susanna Martin, and the Bell Witch. So a huge episode today to get you in the Halloween mood. So let's jump in. So we're going to start off with our stories about witches with what was known as Malleus Maleficarum. And this happened back in the 1400s in Central Europe, which was just a magical time throughout history. Kings and queens were ruling over their kingdoms. Farmers tended their flocks. Little boys and girls were dying at young ages from diseases that could have been prevented if people just knew basic hygiene. And most importantly, witches were roaming the countryside stealing penises. And okay, so that last sentence isn't true, but that is what Heinrich Kramer, a German inquisitor, truly believed was happening in the Tyrol region, now known, which is now part of Italy and Austria. It was such a widespread belief that popes were getting involved. It was really becoming an international crisis throughout Europe. And in 1484, de Chabrun was accused of using magic to murder a noble knight named Jörg Spiess. And after Spiess's death, 6 other women were accused of sorcery in relation to his death. Now, Heinrich Kramer, who believed, who was the biggest proponent of these, wiener stealing witches, he proceeded over the trial. And even though, several witnesses gave testimony that indicated that every woman in the trial had a personal vendetta, against this woman, de Chabrun. And in the end, all 7 women were acquitted. And even though they all kind of were accusing everyone of being witches and that Jörg Spiess, had been killed by a witch and all that, everyone was acquitted. And Kramer was super disappointed. And he set out to work on his masterpiece, which came to be titled Malleus Maleficarum. And the goal of this book was to finally prove to the world that witches were real and were infecting Europe with their dark magic. Kramer's book was published in 1487, and it contained his views on witchcraft. It refuted logical arguments as to how witchcraft wasn't even a real thing, and it discredited smart people who in turn discredited him and provided, the book provided real examples, quote unquote, real examples of how witchcraft was taking place in Europe. And what's amazing about this is Kramer somehow convinced all of the doctors of the theological faculty of the University of Cologne to approve the book and sign it. All right. You think there's some weird stuff going on politically. Like, it was happening in the late 1400s too. Like, this isn't new, unfortunately. Malleus Maleficarum states that there are 3 elements required for witchcraft to occur. 1, evil intentions from the witch. Number 2, help from the devil. And 3, permission from God. And the book is then divided into 3 sections. So the first section provides a surprisingly well thought out overview of witchcraft. Kramer even entertains the idea that witchcraft is just complete crap, saying that the practice is, quote, deluding phantasms of the devil or simply the fantasies of overwrought human minds. Yeah, duh. Yeah, of course. But in the end, Kramer eventually asserts that witchcraft absolutely must be real because Satan is real, despite failing to provide evidence that Satan is real. And that's just, kind of the sort of logic you want in your theoretical, heavily religious-based works. The second section of the book provides actual cases of witchcraft, which included a peculiar epidemic of larceny happening to unfortunate gentlemen across Europe at the time. According to Kramer, witches were collecting as many as 30 penises and then putting them in birds' nests or boxes. The disembodied members then hopped around and ate oats and corn. You can figure out that visual for yourself. And the book notes that when one freshly castrated man who was somehow not dead from blood loss went to the witch and asked her to restore his missing appendage, she led him to the nest where she had amassed an impressive collection and told him to pick one out. Of course, the man reached for the biggest one. "You must not take that one," said the witch, because, that's my witch impression. "That one belonged to the parish priest." Well, of course it did. Of course the parish priest had the biggest dick in the whole region. Of course he did. That's just how that story ends, believe it or not. The third and final section of the book explained the actual witch trial process, which included divinely ordained torture methods for both witnesses and the accused. Kramer advocated for the use of deceptive tactics in order to get confessions. He also approved the reuse of the rack and strappado for torture. I don't have time to get into what those 2 methods were. Google it. Have fun with, seeing all those images that come up. Here's the craziest part, I think, out of all of this, and this book has been crazy. For the next 200 years, Kramer's book was the second highest selling book in Europe behind the Bible. So up until the late 1600s, this book and the Bible, 2 biggest sellers. Insanity. And thanks to humanity's instinctual fear of things they don't understand and often taking what others say at face value without doing their own research, which, guess what, still happens today. Kramer spent the rest of his life giving lectures and speeches about witchcraft, spreading the idea of demonic practices throughout Europe until he died in 1505. So that, unfortunately, sets up pretty much most of the rest of these stories. And we start with the story of Margaret Matson. So south of Philadelphia, on the banks of the Delaware River, is the community of Eddystone, Pennsylvania, which is actually an even older city than Philadelphia. And it was the home of Margaret Matson, who was a Finnish immigrant who had practiced as a healer back in Finland before arriving in the New Sweden colony in 1654. When the British, who were not at all okay with the sort of paganism that Matson practiced, took over the colony 10 years later, Matson's new British neighbors began accusing her of bewitching the cattle. She was quickly arrested and sent to trial on February 7, 1683, where the Pennsylvania colony acted under English witchcraft laws that were nearly 80 years old at this point. And by then, even Matson's own daughter-in-law was accusing her of being a witch. And Matson's charges included causing cows to reduce their milk production and appearing to neighbors in dreams, because seeing people in your dreams in the 1600s wasn't so much of an act of your subconscious as it was the supernatural acts of a witch infiltrating your brain. People. William Penn, the colony's proprietor, oversaw the grand jury of 21 men. And instead of allowing either side to use a lawyer, Penn questioned Matson himself through the use of a translator because no one spoke English. And at the end of the trial, Matson was found guilty of having the reputation of a witch, but not guilty of actually being one, which is, I guess, big for witches' rights everywhere. Matson was released to her husband with a 50-pound bond and a promise of 6 months of good behavior. According to the legend, and Penn dismissed the charges of Matson being a witch by affirming her right to fly on a broomstick, claiming there was no law against it. So what happened? They probably went out and wrote a law about, not being allowed to ride on a broomstick, even though no one had any proof that she was actually riding on a broomstick. William Penn was just like, "Oh, yes, the woman doth not ride on a broomstick, but it is her right to ride on said broomstick because there is not a law forbidding it. I'm sure that's how he talked back in the day. On to our next story, the story of George Burroughs. In 1690, Reverend George Burroughs moved to the small town of Wells, Maine, roughly 30 miles south of Portland, believing it was safer from the attacks from the various native tribes who were really still angry about white people just showing up and taking over. He was a Harvard graduate, he was well-liked in the community, and he was apparently pretty handsome. After his first wife died, Burroughs married a rich widow despite being a minister, which was a comparatively lower-paying role in early New England society. And there were a lot of weird things about this. I mean, one, a minister remarrying, probably not super weird, but it was weird that he was not making as much money as the woman, or didn't have as much money as the woman. And that kind of freaked people out a bit. A year later, George was part of a larger council that was sent to the governor to request improvements to the town of Wells. Somehow, thanks to no one really keeping track of historical records, George was arrested in 1692 on charges of witchcraft, which in New England at the time was as easy as just saying, "Hey, that guy over there is a witch. Arrest him. He's a witch. I don't have any proof. I'm just saying he's a witch, so you should arrest him." And that's what would happen. You would get arrested. According to former members of his congregation, George's identifying witchy characteristic was that he could perform extraordinary feats of strength, which in George's case was he was able to stick his finger into the barrel of his musket and lift it up. And, you know, sure, like musket's probably super heavy, but if you've got kind of a beefy sausage finger, I can see how you could get it up in there and lift it up with a finger. It's possible. But, according to, the geniuses in New England at the time, that was something that could only be done if you were working with the devil and had, supernatural demon strength. It also didn't help that by this time, both of George's wives had died, and many suspected it was because he had cast some sort of demonic spell on them. The jury looked for witches' marks on his body at the trial, which, witches' marks were any sort of claw marks, red or blue brand marks, or warts that signified that you had been physically touched by the devil and turned into a witch. But not surprisingly, they couldn't find anything because witches' marks aren't real. God, these people. Despite a complete lack of evidence of all of these imaginary things, George was still convicted of witchcraft and having a conspiracy with the devil. Obviously, he was sentenced to death at that point, and at his execution, George recited the Lord's Prayer, which was considered an impossible thing for a witch to do. You know why? Because he wasn't an actual witch, or whatever a male witch is. A warlock? He wasn't a warlock. He's probably not a warlock. But it doesn't matter. George Burroughs was hanged in Salem on August 19th, 1692, which made him the only preacher to be hanged as part of the Salem witch trials. And as he swung, as he was kind of just gently swinging lifeless in the breeze, Cotton Mather, who I learned about extensively in my Christian school, turns out he was a complete moron. Although... For to his credit, he's most known for his scientific work on vaccines, but also just a firm believer in every witch being hanged. He arrived on his horse and tried to make people feel better by declaring that George was never an ordained minister and that the devil had actually transformed himself into an angel of light to trick people into believing that George and others were doing the Lord's work. So, it's like, hey, I'm Cotton Mather. Figured out how to not die from a lot of these diseases, but boy, do we have a witch problem, and there's no shot for that. You just gotta hang them. I'm a doctor. Anyway, people here, at the execution were so moved by Mather's impromptu speech that they hanged 4 more suspected witches that day. George's body was taken and dragged into a shallow grave with 2 others, what's sad about this is that no one cared about respecting the dead witches, and they left George's hand, foot, and chin above the dirt in the hole that they had dug. So yeah, that's the end of that one. The next story is the story of Giles Corey. He was an English immigrant who arrived in the Massachusetts colony and settled in Salem Village sometime around 1640. He had 5 children with 3 different wives, mainly because women just had a hard time staying alive back then. They were pretty stubborn about it. But Giles was a wealthy farmer, and he built a solid reputation for himself in the community. In 1676, 65-year-old Corey was put on trial for allegedly beating one of his indentured farm workers to death, i.e. slaves, with a stick after the servant was caught stealing apples from Corey's brother-in-law. Now, Corey argued that he had given the servant medical attention and that the servant had died from his wounds 10 days after the attack. And since corporal punishment like that for indentured servants, slaves, was okay, the murder charge was reduced to death by unreasonable force. On March 19th, 1692, Corey's third wife, Martha, was arrested for witchcraft. And because basically every woman in Salem at this point was being accused of witchcraft, Corey initially believed the charges until he himself was arrested for witchcraft a month later. At that point, Corey didn't think any of this was amusing and refused to cooperate in the trial. And so when he didn't show up for his court date, he was found guilty by default and sent to prison. So because someone who refused to plead one way or another could not actually be tried, one of the silly little Puritan laws dictated that the suspect could undergo, quote, peine forte et dure, which is French for torture you until you break. It's probably a loose translation, I'm guessing. The specific form of torture in the process was known as pressing, where Corey was stripped naked and had a large plank of wood placed on top of him. And from there, authorities laid massive boulders on the wood, slowly increasing the weight as time went on. But to keep him somewhat alive, Corey was given 3 pieces of, quote, the worst bread and 2 cups of stagnant water. And after 2 days of this torture, Corey was asked to plead guilty or not guilty. More weight. I don't know why he's Irish in this. I don't know. But that's what he asked for. He asked for more weight. And so the pressure eventually got so great that Corey's tongue involuntarily shot out of his mouth. And Sheriff George Corwin, who spent time standing on the wood to add more weight to it, took his cane and stuffed Corey's tongue back in his mouth. And eventually, Corey died a short time after that. Corey's wife, who was originally the one accused of witchcraft, was hanged 3 days later. But Corey was eventually absolved in 1712, even though his wife wasn't. And for many years after his death, people believed that Corey's ghost was appearing at his gravesite just before disaster was about to strike the area. There were several reported sightings just before the Great Salem Fire of 1914. Even stranger was that several sheriffs subsequently died in office or suffered strange heart issues while on the job in Salem. Once the sheriff's department was moved, however, from Salem to Middleton in 1991, all of the sightings and problems stopped. So apparently Giles Corey was just haunting the old Salem sheriff's house, which is weird. 2 more stories to go here. So this one is about Susanna Martin, who was an English immigrant to the Massachusetts colony. In 1646, she married George Martin, a widower and a blacksmith, and the 2 immediately got into bed and produced 8 children. Fun fact, including the great-great-great-great-grandmother of President Chester A. Arthur. So, a president had a future president, which, I mean, come on. How many of you expected to hear a Chester A. Arthur reference today? You haven't thought about Chester Arthur since middle school. And even then you probably forgot that he was a president, but he was. Fun facts. You're going to learn. You learn on this podcast. It's not just entertaining. It's educational, even if it's horrifying education. Anyway, in 1669, William Sargent Jr. accused Susanna Martin of being a witch. And in response, George, Susanna's husband, sued Sargent on 2 counts of slander, one for being a witch and the other for claiming that one of her children was illegitimate and another being a demon fairy, because even people in the 1600s had just really silly arguments. It's not just a thing on social media and Twitter anymore. However, charges on both sides were eventually dropped and everything just kind of settled down. Well, George Martin died in 1686, leaving Susanna with 8 kids and pretty much nothing else. 6 years later, Susanna was accused of witchcraft again after 2 residents in Salem Village claimed she had attempted to recruit them into witchcraft school. Another man in the nearby village of Salisbury claimed Susanna had bewitched his cattle, which caused them to drown themselves in the river. Again, and just because, and people could just accuse you and you couldn't fight it. You're just, all right, hey, this guy said you were a witch. We're going to just arrest you. and we'll put you on trial. So at her trial, Susanna proved that she proved that she wasn't a witch by freely quoting Bible verses, which was something that a witch wasn't supposed to be able to do. However, Cotton Mather showed back up and claimed that servants of the devil had the power to fake innocence and godliness. I mean, he just makes this stuff up as he goes because, well, we can't, we've got smallpox. That's a big enough problem to worry about. Just can't have all these witches running around. And just so, she can quote Bible verses. Well, I mean, the devil they can do that, She literally goes to church every day, man. And she goes to confession. We don't even do confessions. And she goes to confessionals. Well, the devil, they can give them demonic immunity to go into churches. See, normally you can, normally a witch would begin burning as soon as she walked in the church. But actually, you believe me on this, the devil can give demonic immunity to witches so that they are protected and shielded from burning inside a church for up to 2 hours. Have you ever seen Susanna Martin in a church for over 2 hours? Well, no, but then again, our methods for telling time here aren't exactly super accurate. So, well, that's my point. That's my point. She has the demonic immunity. Go ahead and hang her. That's probably what happened, or something along those lines. So where are we at here? Prosecutors examined Susanna Martin, who was 71 years old at this point, twice for evidence of a witch's tit. That's the exact phrase. I'm not just saying that for fun, even though witch's tit just is fun to say. The witch's tit is also known as a supernumerary nipple. I stumbled over that one. Supernumerary. There we go. Supernumerary nipple. So just like a third one, just randomly somewhere, that would have somehow been evidence of her being a witch. But they couldn't find one. They did note, however, that Susanna's breasts were pretty swollen and firm in the morning, but had kind of deflated by the afternoon. And they took that as evidence that she had been visited by a witch at some point in the day and given milk. I don't even know. Look, I've said before on this podcast, I don't know how a woman's body works, but I didn't know that 71-year-old women could give milk. And I don't know. I don't know. I'm not going to Google that because there are just some things on my Google search history I don't want in the world. But I don't know. That just seems crazy to me. But if you're a woman and you're like, well, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, cool. Maybe I'm going to learn something today. I don't know. But that was all the evidence they needed. And they sentenced Susanna to hanging. And she did. So this last story here is the story of the Bell Witch. And this is an odd story because the Bell Witch could possibly just be an episode in and of itself, but I wanted to include it in here because this story lasts for so long and it's so crazy. Several people throughout history have had run-ins with this Bell Witch. And so it's a good candidate for being one of those paranormal stories that's just like, oh, wow, that could be actually true. Could be true. Anyway, it starts in the summer of 1817 in a rural part of northern Tennessee near the Kentucky border. John Bell was tending to his farm when he saw a strange figure appear. It had a rabbit's head, but the whole creature was as big as a dog. John quickly fired his gun at the animal, but it just vanished into thin air. Over the next few days, John and the rest of the family began hearing scratching and knocking on the walls. They heard the constant sound of lips smacking together, and that's annoying. I'm sure consciously, I know I do that at some points during the show. I've tried to kind of minimize that enough, but sometimes my mouth gets dry from talking a lot, and I just gotta lean out of the way and bring her right back on up here. But hopefully you're not too annoyed by that. Hopefully you're not looking out for that now. That would ruin your entire day. Along with the lip smacking and the scratching, sheets were inexplicably pulled off the bed at night. John's youngest daughter, Betsy, seemed to be the most tormented by this. She had her hair pulled, she was slapped and pinched, she had pins stuck into her body, and no one could really figure out what was going on. So John eventually went to his friend James Johnston for help, and Johnston agreed to spend the night in the Bell home to see what was going on. And that night, he woke up to the same scratching, knocking, and lip smacking that, the Bell family had reported. There's a spirit just like in the Bible. That's a quote from Johnston. I'm sure that's exactly what he sounded like. And I obviously, because we all know about those spirits in the Bible who, scratch and smack their lips. Sure. As these things tend to do, words spread throughout the community and people began traveling from all over the state and Kentucky to experience the haunting. The spirit began speaking out loud and having full conversations with the Bell family. John Johnston, who was James's son, wasn't fully convinced that the spirit was real and decided to test it by asking something that only the Johnston's family would know. And so John asked the spirit what his Dutch step-grandmother in North Carolina used to say to the slaves whenever they did something wrong. And so, he's just like, all right, Bill Wick, what did my step-grandmother in North Carolina say to slaves whenever they done something wrong? And he waited. And then all of a sudden he hears, "Hut, tut, what has happened now?" And it had the step-grandmother's accent and everything. And John likely sold himself at that point and went home and just didn't want anything else to do with whatever happened in the house. After some additional prodding by the Bell family, the spirit eventually revealed that her name was Old Kate Bat's Witch, who some historians kind of believe was someone that John Bell had actually murdered back in North Carolina. There was not a lot of evidence to back that claim up, but that's what they went with. Kate expressed displeasure with Betsy's engagement to a man named Joshua Gardner, but when Betsy refused to call off the wedding, Kate got really angry and began referring to John Bell as Old Jack. Why? Who knows? Ghosts and witches can be confused sometimes. Kate said she intended to kill John Bell, by cursing him and threatening, and soon after, John Bell was actually poisoned to death. At his funeral, while people sang hymns, Kate actually intervened and began singing drinking songs out of just thin air. In 1821, Betsy finally called off the engagement, and so Kate, who was happy with this decision, told the family she would leave them alone but return again in a few years to just kind of check up on them. In 1828, Kate exactly did as she said. She reappeared to the Bell family, and at this point, however, John Bell's widow, Lucy, and her sons, Richard and Joel, just weren't about to entertain Kate's weird scratching and lip smacking anymore. And so rather than engage with Kate, the family ignored her, and Kate eventually left the family alone. In January 1890, so almost over 60 years later, the Bell Witch returned. A man named Holloway was feeding his cattle when he saw two women arrive at his house in Adams Station, Tennessee, near the old Bell farmstead, and he saw them get off their horses. But by the time he arrived at his yard to greet them, the women, the horses were gone. There was no evidence of where they had went. Holloway's wife said that she had also seen the women, but had no idea where they went to. Later that week, a guy named Mr. Rowland attempted to mount a sack of corn onto the back of his horse. However, every time he tried, the sack would just fall off. He eventually called Joe Johnson over to his house to help, and as Johnson held the sack down on the horse's back, Rowland mounted it and began to ride off. And they thought everything was fine, but then the two men watched as the sack just floated away before settling on a fence roughly 20 yards away. "You won't touch this sack anymore." I don't know why. I don't know what that was. That was apparently the Bell Witch's voice. Sure, whatever. And that's what the two men heard. And by all accounts, they didn't touch it. They just left it on the fence. The next month, Joe Johnson was visiting a man named Buck Smith when the two heard a knock on the door. When they opened the door, there was nothing there, but then they heard knocking on a different door. And they went over to that door, but again, nothing was there, so they just went back to the living room and sat down. Suddenly, Buck's dog began just like jumping at, fighting with something invisible. And then 2 minutes later, the doors blew open and fire swept through the entire house. However, nothing was burned, and the two men were able to put the fire out within just a few minutes. Really weird. Well, later that night, as Johnson returned home, he felt something jump on his back and grab his shoulder. And rather than stop and figure out what was going on, Johnson forced his horse to sprint down the path. And just before he arrived home, he felt the force jump from his horse and run off into the woods. He had no idea what it was, but I mean, obviously it was the witch. Later that year, a man named Mr. Winters shot an odd-looking bird. But when he got home and opened his bag, he was startled to find that the bird had been replaced with a rabbit. Or maybe Winters just didn't know what the difference was between a bird and a rabbit. That's possibly it. Meanwhile, the same Mr. Rowland from the floating corn sack story was visited by a one-eyed black man who asked Rowland to follow him and start digging at a large rock near his property. Now, this is an important part of the story, all right? A lot of the other stuff was kind of weird. This is kind of an important, crazy story, part of the story. When the two arrived at the rock, the black man just disappeared. But instead of running home, being super creeped out, Rowland dug all through the night. The next morning, Joe Johnson and a man named Bill Burgess arrived to help continue the dig. They eventually hit what they thought was a kettle, but when they tried to remove it from the ground, the soil inexplicably began moving back to fill in the hole, and they were never actually able to dig up the kettle that they found. Fast forward to 1937, so now we're about, another 40 or so odd years down the line. A man named Lewis Garrison was working on his property near the Bell Witch Cave, which was the name given to a cave on the land formerly owned by the Bells that was said to house the Bell Witch's spirit. Lewis began hearing a piano playing and something rub up against his house, and then he watched a piece of paper flutter through one door, or flutter out one door and then re-enter through another. Really strange, and nothing really ever came of that. It's just a strange story. Later that year, a group of Methodists on a church activity were having a wiener roast at the quarry near the Bell Witch Cave. I'm sure they were just grilling hot dogs. They weren't, doing anything nefarious there. And as the group was actually joking about the Bell Witch, one of them looked up and saw a woman sitting on the top of the cliff over the mouth of the cave. And a bunch of those little kids just ran for their lives. But the minister who was leading the group claimed to have investigated it and said it was just moonlight and shadows that caused the illusion of the woman. But several people looked at the weather report that night and revealed that the moon was barely visible on the night of the event, and that it couldn't have possibly been that. It was definitely the witch. Now, in 1965, this is where I said the kettle story was important. In 1965, a rocking chair that had previously been owned by Charlie Willett, who was a descendant of the Bell family, sold a rocking chair to the owner of an antique shop. And although the antique shop owner didn't put the chair up for sale, a customer came in and sat down in it and asked the owner if the chair was supernatural. And the antique shop owner told, the customer all about the Bell family. And for some reason, then this customer left the store and visited the cemetery where several of the Bell family members were buried. All of a sudden, this customer's looking around, and then she hears a voice. "Stand up and look around. You'll find something of much value." I don't know what accent that was, but it wasn't something from Tennessee, I can tell you that. The woman walked around the field for a bit before stumbling across a black iron kettle. Whoa! Crazy, right? When she turned the kettle over, she found a pearl buckle. She immediately took it to a jeweler who estimated that the buckle was somewhere between 160 and 200 years old. Now, no one knows whether or not it was the same kettle that Rowland had tried to dig up 75 years before, but that's just a crazy coincidence. Fast forward again to 1977, a group of 5 soldiers from Fort Campbell visited the Bell Witch Cave. When one soldier openly doubted the legend of the Bell Witch, he immediately felt something invisible grab his chest, and the soldiers ran away scared. In 1986, David Gerard of the Tennessean and photographer Bill Wilson were given permission to stay inside the Bell Witch Cave overnight. As the two settled in for the night, they heard what was described as an unwavering groan from deeper in the cave, along with several loud thumps. When the sequence happened for a third time, the two were like, "All right, we're done, bro," and they ran out of the cave. The two checked the wiring in the cave lights to see if the noise was coming from a short in the wires, but they found nothing. So, thinking it was just all in their heads, they decided to go back into the cave and try again. But as they settled in, they heard a low rumble and ran for the exit again. But This time, they realized that the rumble was just being caused by a passing jet. So, just as they prepared to enter the cave for a third time, they're like, all right, seriously, there's nothing wrong with this cave. It's all in our heads. They heard a high-pitched scream come from inside of the cave that definitely had no logical explanation. And so the two promptly went back to their vehicles and never went back to the cave. The last incidents of the Bell Witch happened the next year in 1987, when H.C. Sanders, a gas station owner, ironically ran out of gas near the Bell Witch cave. And so as he walked toward town to fill up his portable tank, he noticed there was a rabbit that had come out of the woods and started to follow him. And Sanders, a little unnerved by the rabbit following him, started to walk faster. And then when the rabbit kept pace, Sanders broke into a full sprint. And a mile down the road, Sanders sat down on a log to catch his breath. "Hell of a race we had there, wasn't it?" asked the rabbit. The rabbit said this. In 1987, a talking rabbit said that to a man. Believe it. Maybe. I don't know. That's just what he says. Nothing related to the Bell Witch or the Bell Witch Cave has been reported since then. And while no one has a really good explanation for the various events that have happened over the years, several people have come to believe that Betsy Bell, who later became known for her reputation for committing fraud, made up the entire story of the witch to scam people out of supplies and other resources. Skeptics think the Bell Witch story was spread and retold to gullible people who had no real connection to the Bells. In fact, the story actually found its way to General Andrew Jackson, who at some point had his own encounter with the witch while bringing supplies to the Bell farmstead. I'm a little skeptical on that story because the witch didn't appear until after the War of 1812, where Jackson was, prominent, but also Jackson didn't really become president until mid 1820s or something like that. So, I mean, it's possible, but still, I'm a little skeptical on that one. At this point, many people believe that there is a real witch that exists out in this cave, while others think it was just a scam from Betsy Bell that just kind of got way out of control. So, whether you want to believe it or not, to me, this was one of those stories that there's a lot going on there that seems pretty, pretty strange. Tennessee is not that far from where I am. I kind of do want to go check it out one day and see for myself. But thanks for hanging in there. That concludes all of our stories today. Whew, my voice feels very tired. So let's wrap this up here and see what we learned today.
What did we learn?
Number one, people really believed that witches were going around and stealing wieners in Europe in the 1500s, and they continued to believe that for over 200 years, thanks to Malleus Maleficarum. Just insane. The number 2 selling book in all of Europe likely influenced a lot of what happened in the Salem witch trials. And speaking of that, number 2, you used to be able to just get rid of anyone you wanted in your life just by going, "Hey, that guy's a witch. Well, that woman's a witch. She sucks. You should get rid of her." And no one would question you for it. They would just be like, "Oh, okay, cool. Thank you, good citizen, for keeping our community safe. I won't question your methods at all. I will just go arrest and hang this woman." Whatever. Number 3, there may actually be a real live witch who haunts a rural part of northern Tennessee. And maybe one day I will go out there and investigate for myself. Next week on Our Weird World, we're talking about werewolves because they're part of Halloween too. We're going to have multiple stories with the tales of Gilles Gagne, Peter Stump, Thies of Kaltenbrunn, and Bill Ramsey. So we'll see if werewolves are just as real as the witches, and my guess is probably. And by probably, I mean they're probably not real. But you know what? It's fun to find out. So thank you for listening. Tell all your friends and keep it weird.